The winter of 1943 pressed down on Europe like a clenched fist. Snow crusted the forests along the German border, turning roads into frozen scars and foxholes into open graves. For Captain Daniel Mercer of the United States Army, the cold was just another enemy. Silent, patient, always waiting. He stood on the back of a transport truck rumbling east, helmet pulled low, breath fogging the air as he watched the grey countryside crawl by. Mercer had crossed the Atlantic with the 36th Infantry Division 6 months earlier, trading Texas heat for Italian dust, then French mud, and now this, Germany's outer skin. He was 32, already older than he felt he should be in a young man's war. His men called him Cap, sometimes behind his back, sometimes to his face, and he wore their trust like an extra piece of gear, heavy but necessary. The mission briefing that morning had been short and ugly. Recon patrol. Deep. Too deep. German armor had been spotted moving through the valley ahead, and command wanted eyes on it. Not planes, not guesses, men. Feels like a trap, Sergeant Tommy O'Hara muttered as he checked his rifle beside Mercer. O'Hara was from Brooklyn, built lean and tough, with eyes that never stopped scanning. Every damn thing feels like a trap lately. Mercer didn't argue. He'd learned not to lie to his men. Just keep your head down, he said. We get in. We look. We get out. They didn't get out. The ambush came fast. Too fast. One moment, they were moving through a stand of pines, boots crunching softly on snow. The next, the world exploded into gunfire. MG-42s tore through the trees, bark and blood spraying alike. Men shouted. Someone screamed for a medic. Mercer hit the ground hard, heart hammering, trying to shout orders through the chaos. "Fall back! Smoke out!" he yelled, but the words vanished into the roar. They fought for 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours. Then the firing stopped, not because the Germans withdrew, but because they didn't have to shoot anymore. Surrounded, outnumbered, out of options. A German officer stepped forward, immaculate even in the snow, pistol raised, not aimed, just present. The message was clear. O'Hara looked at Mercer, jaw tight. "Orders, Cap?" Mercer swallowed. He thought of the men already down, of the ones still breathing and looking at him. He raised his hands. The march to the prison camp took 2 days. 2 days of hunger, of frostbitten fingers, of wounded men stumbling through snow under barking commands. The Germans laughed sometimes, short, sharp sounds that carried no warmth. They mocked the prisoners' accents, their patched uniforms, their exhaustion. By the time they reached the camp, Mercer's boots were soaked through and his legs felt like wood. The camp itself squatted in a shallow valley, ringed by barbed wire and watchtowers. Smoke rose from a handful of buildings inside, thin and grey against the sky. A sign in German hung crookedly by the gate. Mercer didn't need to read it to know what it meant. Inside, they were herded into a central yard. Prisoners already there. Americans, a few Canadians, some French, watched with hollow eyes. But it was the British who stood out. They were lined up off to one side, perhaps 24 of them, wearing worn khaki uniforms marked with the faded insignia of British regiments. At first glance, they looked like any other POWs, tired, dirty, beaten down by months of captivity. Then Mercer noticed their size. They were huge, not just tall, but broad, barrel-chested men with shoulders like oxen and hands that looked capable of bending iron. One of them, a red-haired giant with a broken nose, caught Mercer staring and gave him the faintest nod. "What the hell are they feeding those guys?" O'Hara whispered. A ripple of laughter drifted from the far side of the yard. A group of German officers had gathered near a long table, coats pressed, boots polished. Generals, by the look of them, men who had never slept in mud or bled in snow. One of them, a heavy-set man with a scar down his cheek, pointed toward the British prisoners and said something that made the others laugh harder. Mercer didn't understand German well, but he didn't need to. The tone was universal. Mockery. contempt. A guard translated loudly, for effect. They say England sends farmers and dockhands to fight. Big men, yes, but stupid, strong like animals. The British prisoners didn't react. They stood still, eyes forward, faces carved from stone. But Mercer saw something else beneath the surface, an iron calm, a patience that made his skin prickle. Later, in the barracks, a long, cold building that smelled of damp straw and old sweat, Mercer sat on a wooden bunk and tried to flex his numb fingers. O'Hara dropped down beside him. "You see those Brits?" the sergeant said quietly. "Those ain't farmers." "No," Mercer agreed. "They're something else." That night, as wind rattled the walls and guards' footsteps crunched outside, Mercer lay awake, listening to the low murmur of voices. Somewhere down the row, one of the British men was speaking softly, his accent thick but calm, telling a story that made the others chuckle under their breath. For the first time since the ambush, Mercer felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not hope, exactly. More like the sense that the enemy had made a mistake they didn't yet understand. Morning in the camp arrived without ceremony. No reveille, no colors raised, just a guard kicking the barracks door open and barking orders in German while frost clung to the inside of the walls. Mercer pushed himself upright, joints screaming, breath fogging the dim air. Around him, men stirred like ghosts, faces gaunt, eyes adjusting to another day that promised nothing and could take everything. Roll call took nearly an hour. The Germans enjoyed it that way, forcing prisoners to stand still in the cold, correcting posture with rifle butts, counting and recounting as if daring someone to collapse. One American did. He pitched forward into the snow, knees buckling, and didn't get back up. "Medic!" someone shouted. A German guard laughed and nudged the fallen man with his boot. "He sleeps," he said in broken English. Mercer clenched his fists until his nails bit skin. Across the yard, the British prisoners stood unmoving. Not a sway, not a tremor. Their faces were pale with cold, but their posture was rigid, disciplined. One of the German generals noticed too. The scar-faced general stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. He walked the line of prisoners slowly, like a man inspecting livestock. When he reached the British, he stopped. "These are the giants," he said, loud enough for the yard to hear. "England's pride." He circled one of them, the red-haired giant Mercer had noticed before. The man's uniform hung loose on him now, but there was no mistaking the mass beneath it. "You think size wins wars?" the general asked, smiling thinly. "Look at you now. No weapons, no country, just prisoners." The Brit didn't answer, didn't blink. The general scoffed and moved on, satisfied. That afternoon, work details were assigned. Digging trenches, hauling timber, clearing snow, the heaviest labor went to the British. The Germans watched closely, waiting for them to falter, to prove the joke right. They didn't. Mercer worked beside O'Hara, clearing ice from a drainage ditch. His hands burned, shoulders aching, but his eyes kept drifting toward the British detail, hauling logs twice the length of a man. 4 Germans supervised them, rifles slung casually, laughing and smoking as the prisoners strained under the weight. "Look at that," O'Hara muttered. "They ain't even breathing hard." One of the British stumbled, not from weakness, but from a guard shoving him with a rifle butt. The log slipped, crashing into the snow. The guard shouted, raised his weapon again. Before Mercer could think, the red-haired giant stepped forward. He didn't touch the guard, didn't threaten him. He just stood there, close enough that the guard had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. The yard went quiet. For a long second, no one moved. Then, another guard barked something sharp, and the first one backed away, face flushed. The log was lifted again. Work resumed. Mercer let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That night, in the barracks, the mood was different. Still grim, but charged. Men whispered. Eyes darted toward the British corner. One of them approached Mercer's bunk. Up close, The man was even bigger, his shadow swallowing the dim lantern light. He spoke softly. "Name's Arthur Bennett," he said. "Royal Engineers." "Daniel Mercer," Mercer replied, rising halfway. "U.S. Army." Bennett nodded. "You Americans fight hard." "So do you," Mercer said. "Germans don't seem to think so." A flicker of something, amusement maybe, crossed Bennett's face. "They mistake quiet for weakness." O'Hara leaned in. "You boys planning something?" Bennett didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the door, then back. "We're surviving," he said carefully. "Same as you." Days turned into weeks. The Germans grew bolder in their mockery, especially the generals who visited the camp more frequently now. They'd heard rumors, whispers of Allied landings, of setbacks on the Eastern Front, and they took it out on the prisoners. Punishments increased. Food rations shrank. One night, a Canadian was dragged out for hoarding bread and came back barely conscious. Mercer felt the pressure building, like the air before a storm. He saw it in the British too, the way they trained their bodies, even in captivity, using stolen moments to stretch, to move, to stay ready. He saw it in Bennett's eyes when guards turned their backs. Then came the announcement. All prisoners were ordered into the yard. The generals stood waiting, flanked by guards with machine guns. The scar-faced general spoke, his voice carrying easily. "Tomorrow," he said, "there will be a demonstration, a reminder of German order, strength, discipline." He gestured toward the British. "Our large friends will participate." Mercer felt his stomach drop. That night, no one slept. Bennett sat on the edge of his bunk, hands clasped, eyes closed as if in prayer. Mercer approached quietly. "What kind of demonstration?" Mercer asked. Bennett opened his eyes. In the low light, they looked almost gentle. "They want to show you," he said. "That size doesn't matter." "And you?" Mercer asked. Bennett stood. The ceiling seemed lower with him upright. "We intend to show them," he said, voice steady, "that they're wrong." Outside, a guard shouted. Boots crunched past the barracks. Somewhere, a dog barked. Mercer returned to his bunk, heart pounding, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, for better or worse. He stared into the darkness, waiting for dawn. Dawn came wrapped in fog, thick and low, swallowing the camp whole. The siren wailed before the sun broke through, a long, metallic howl that clawed men out of shallow sleep. Mercer was already awake, boots on, heart thudding like it had during his first firefight in Italy. He met O'Hara's eyes across the barracks. Neither spoke. Outside, the yard was different, cleared, raked. Guards stood at full attention along the wire, machine guns mounted in the towers already tracking invisible lines across the snow. The generals were there too, 3 of them this time, coats immaculate, gloves spotless, faces carved from certainty. The prisoners were lined up by nationality, Americans on the left, British on the right. The scar-faced general stepped forward. "Today," he announced, "we demonstrate discipline, obedience, the reality of power." He gestured, and guards moved toward the British line. 6 of them were pulled out, Bennett among them. Mercer's chest tightened when he saw him step forward, calm as ever, hands clasped behind his back. The other British prisoners didn't look at him. They stared straight ahead, jaws set. "In our army," the general continued, "strength is controlled, directed. Yours is wasted." A guard shoved Bennett toward a wooden structure in the center of the yard, a crude obstacle course of beams, ropes, and trenches, half buried in snow. It looked like something meant for training, not punishment. Mercer felt a flicker of confusion. The general smiled. "You will run it," he said. "Timed. Any failure will be corrected." The whistle blew. Bennett moved. He didn't charge. He flowed. Over the first beam, Under the second, boots hitting frozen ground with controlled force. The other 5 followed, moving in tight sequence, muscle and memory working together. Mercer felt his breath catch. This wasn't brute strength. This was training. The guards shouted, startled now. One fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked across the yard, but the British didn't slow. At the rope climb, Bennett went first, hands like clamps, pulling himself up with terrifying ease. He dropped down the other side, landing clean, already moving. The others followed. The general's smiles faded. "Faster!" One of them barked at the guards. A guard rushed forward, swinging his rifle at one of the British men as he landed. The blow glanced off the man's shoulder. He stumbled, then recovered, eyes flashing. That was the moment. Bennett stopped running. He turned. For a heartbeat, the yard froze. Then all 6 British prisoners moved as one. Bennett grabbed the rifle mid-swing and wrenched it free with a twist that snapped wood. Another Brit tackled a guard into the snow. A third swung a fist the size of a hammer, dropping a man cold. Shouts erupted. Guns came up in the towers. "Hold! Your fire!" The scar-faced general screamed, panic breaking through his composure. Too late. The camp exploded into chaos. Americans surged forward instinctively, years of training and months of rage boiling over. Mercer vaulted a low barrier, tackling a guard who'd turned his rifle toward the British. O'Hara was beside him, moving like a street brawler, fists and elbows flying. Shots rang out, some into the air, some into bodies. A British prisoner went down, blood blooming in the snow. Bennett roared, not in pain, but fury, and charged a guard tower ladder. He tore the gunner down with him, both crashing hard. Sirens screamed. Mercer felt time fracture, every second stretched thin and sharp. He saw a German officer scrambling for cover, slipping on ice. He saw a young American, barely 20, freeze in the open, eyes wide, before a British man yanked him down as bullets stitched the ground where he'd stood. "Get the weapons!" someone yelled. Mercer grabbed a dropped rifle, hands shaking, and fired at a tower spotlight, shattering it. Darkness swallowed that corner of the yard. Cheers rose, brief, wild, desperate. Then the machine guns opened up for real. The towers lit the yard with fire. Men dropped. Screams cut through smoke and snow. Mercer hit the ground hard, dragging O'Hara with him as rounds chewed through the air above. "This is it!" O'Hara shouted, breath ragged. "They're gonna mow us down!" Mercer looked toward the British. Bennett was still standing, blood on his sleeve, directing men with sharp gestures. Left, down, now. He locked eyes with Mercer across the chaos and shouted something Mercer couldn't hear. Then the gates blew open. Not outward, inward. Explosions ripped through the main entrance, shredding wood and wire. German guards spun in confusion as figures poured through the smoke, armed, fast, deadly. Resistance fighters, French by the look of them, wearing mismatched coats and carrying stolen German weapons. Behind them, American uniforms. The sound of hope was deafening. The firefight turned on its head. Germans fled or surrendered. Towers fell silent one by one. Mercer surged forward, rifle steady now, adrenaline burning away fear. Within minutes, somehow, it was over. The yard was a ruin. Bodies lay twisted in snow-stained dark. Smoke drifted low. Survivors stood in stunned silence, weapons lowered, breath coming hard. Bennett found Mercer near the shattered gate. He looked suddenly human again, exhausted, wounded, eyes rimmed red. "Told you," he said hoarsely. "They were wrong." Mercer nodded, throat tight. The weight of what they'd just lived through crashing down on him all at once. But even as Allied fighters began shouting orders, "Move out, now, before reinforcements," the reality settled in. Not everyone was leaving. Some never would. Mercer looked back at the camp one last time, knowing the cost of defiance had been paid in blood, and that the war was far from over. They moved fast. That was the only reason any of them lived. The resistance fighters pushed the prisoners through the shattered gates and into the trees beyond the camp, urging them forward in hushed, urgent voices. Vite! Vite! Boots crunched through snow and frozen mud as men stumbled, helped one another, half-carried the wounded. Mercer kept his arm locked around O'Hara's waist, feeling the sergeant's weight sag heavier with every step. "You let go. I'll shoot you myself," O'Hara rasped, blood soaking through his sleeve. "Shut up and move," Mercer shot back, voice breaking. Behind them, the camp burned. Flames licked at the barracks, smoke twisting into the sky like a signal flare that would draw German reinforcements soon enough. Too soon. Bennett ran ahead despite his wound, one hand pressed to his arm, the other guiding men through the trees with quiet authority. He moved like someone who had done this before, escape routes mapped in his bones long before the first shot was fired. They reached a ravine nearly a mile from the camp, a narrow cut in the land that swallowed sound and light. There, they collapsed, panting, shaking, alive. Medics from the resistance moved quickly, binding wounds with rough efficiency. Morphine was scarce, so were bandages, but hands were steady, eyes kind. Mercer sat in the snow, helmet discarded, staring at his hands. They were still shaking. He didn't know if they would ever stop. A young resistance fighter crouched beside him and offered a cigarette. Mercer took it without thinking. The first drag burned his lungs, grounding him in the moment. "You Americans," the fighter said in accented English. "You came back for them." Mercer exhaled slowly. "They came back for us." Bennett approached, his massive frame looking smaller now, slumped with exhaustion. He lowered himself onto a rock with a grunt. "You all right?" Mercer asked. Bennett nodded once. "Lost good men." His voice caught, just slightly. "But we broke the cage. They didn't linger. By nightfall, they were moving again, split into smaller groups, guided through forests and frozen fields toward Allied lines. The journey took days. Men collapsed and were hauled back to their feet. Some never made it farther than the ravine, wrapped in blankets and left with whispered apologies. When Mercer finally crossed into territory held by American armor, he didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. Med tents buzzed with activity. Doctors barked orders. Nurses moved with practiced calm, eyes softening only when they thought no one was looking. O'Hara was taken from Mercer's grip and wheeled away, already slipping under anesthesia. "Don't you die on me," Mercer muttered as they rolled him off. O'Hara grinned weakly. "Wouldn't miss the parade, Cap." Mercer laughed then, sharp and wet, and scrubbed his face with shaking hands. News of the camp spread quickly. Intelligence officers asked questions. Commanders listened grimly. The Germans' cruelty, their arrogance, the way they had underestimated the men they'd caged, it all went into reports that would shape how the war was fought tomorrow. A week later, Mercer stood outside a field hospital watching trucks roll east. Fresh troops, fresh faces, the war grinding on. Bennett stood beside him, arm in a sling, uniform replaced with borrowed American fatigues stretched tight across his shoulders. "Men now. They may say we'll be moving north," Bennett said. "Back to the fight." Mercer nodded. "Figures." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to engines and distant artillery. "You know," Bennett said quietly, "they laughed because they needed us to laugh. Their knee needed to believe. We were less than them." Mercer glanced at him. "Didn't work out." Bennett's mouth twitched. "No." Weeks later, Mercer would learn that the generals from the camp hadn't escaped. One was captured, one killed in a retreat. The scar-faced one vanished into the chaos, swallowed by the war he'd thought himself above. O'Hara survived. Barely. He walked with a limp after that, cursed louder, laughed harder. He never complained. As for Mercer, the memories stayed. The cold, The wire. The moment when prisoners became brothers, and brothers became a force the enemy couldn't control. Years later, long after the guns fell silent, he would remember the sight of those British giants standing unbroken in the snow, silent, under mockery, waiting. Waiting for the moment the world would learn what strength really looked like. And he would remember that sometimes history turns not on generals or flags, but on the quiet decision of men who refuse to stay caged.